This program is a paid commercial announcement from Jacob Media Partners and does not reflect the views of WPHT or its management.
Now on Talk Radio 1210, WPHT, WPHT HD, WOGL HD3, Philadelphia. It's Legal Eagles Radio with Sam Pond. From the courtroom to the boardroom to Talk Radio 1210. Get educated on the law from one of the most powerful attorneys in the country. Legal Eagles Radio with Sam Pond, featuring who's who in the Delaware Valley legal community. Welcome to the courtroom, and welcome to Legal Eagles Radio, and your host, Sam Pond.
Legal Eagles Radio with Sam Pond as we come to you in Philadelphia on Talk Radio 1210, WPHT, and in Pittsburgh on KDKA. And we welcome our listening audience in to another week of legal education, Sam, I think is the best way to characterize what this show stands for and what it's all about. And now that we've clicked into 2019, and for those listening who have been with the program from the very beginning, we've started to lay down the foundation of the program, and now we're starting to expand topics and expand our conversation. Our special guest today that is going to join us for the entire hour has his heritage and his roots right in KDKA's background, right from Pittsburgh. We'll bring him into the conversation once we get through your opening monologue, but excited for the conversation and the topic today.
Yeah, Joe, it's our second show of the year, and we're going to continue to carry out our mission of educating our listeners about the law. And it all starts, folks, with educating yourselves. We're going to hopefully give you the kickoff to educate yourself. We're going to give you a little kernel. We're going to give you a nudge. And then you got to be self-reliant. You got to wake up. You got to get in the game. And you got to get rid of your ignorance about the law, because it's right at the core of you being a citizen. And talking about the game, just a shout out to the Philadelphia Eagles, another Pennsylvania team. We're proud to be their partners. Great season. And we look forward to both the Eagles and the Steelers season next year. It's great to have these two wonderful championship teams in our Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Joe and Joe, today I want to talk about what's on everyone's mind, and that is this shutdown, this government shutdown. So we need to let our audience know about where does this come from? How can it be done in our democracy? Well, again, folks, always go to the Constitution. Article 2, Section 1. Article 2, Section 1 provides executive powers. In other words, provides powers to the President of the United States. We have the three branches of government, right? What are they? The executive, the President, and then we have the legislature, both the Congress, the House of Representatives, the Senate, and then the third branch that we often overlook but really interprets the Constitution, and that's our judiciary. That's our Supreme Court. And by the way, Joe Kraus, we're going to talk in a future show about someone that I think is as important as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Hamilton, and all the other greats of our founding fathers. And that's a mystery giant that we're going to talk, and he's in that judicial branch. We're going to talk about it in a future show. And by the way, in the future show, the first 10 callers are going to get the recent book about this giant. Having said that, let's talk about the shutdown. So the president, how's it work? How's our democracy work, Joe Doc? Congress is really in charge of appropriations, in other words, spending. So they create a budget, and then they sign off on it, and it has to go over to the president for his signature. Unless he signs it, nothing happens. And he's refusing to sign the budget that came out of not only the House of Representatives, but the Republican-controlled Senate. They approved it under McConnell's leadership. He's refused to sign that. You know, we had a couple radio hosts that have bigger mouths than me and a bigger platform than Sam Pond that came out, and all of a sudden he refused to sign it. We thought he was on board, but he didn't. This is actually analogous to a budget that happens to have in my home. My wife and I have to agree how much we're going to spend for the year. If she doesn't agree and she's a signature on the checkbook, we can't get anything done. We have a pond family shutdown for 19. Okay? So that's really what's happening. So what is really what's the barrier here? The barrier is this wall that President Trump told us was going to start at over $20 billion. He's now down to $5 billion. We have $1 trillion budget plus. And this is all over something that we've never had in our life. And by the way, California, Arizona, and New Mexico, through their entire border, have a full fence. Okay? But what's the issue? Why do we need this? Wake up. Know the facts. Here's the facts. In December of 18, the Pew Institute, independent, not for either party, illegals from Mexico alone were down by 1 million. There were 130,000 last year. There were 1.6 million in 2000. In fact, based on Homeland Security numbers that we now know, we know that these numbers have been dropping left and right like flies. So what is all this about? This is about politics. Politics as usual. And you know what? It is, Joe Doc, holding government workers hostage. Holding them hostage to what's happening and not allowing them to get paid. But also now it's costing us billions of dollars in production. We can't get our planes to take off. The safety of issue in regard to air traffic control. In fact, our own border folks can't go out and protect our borders because we don't have it. Do you know, Joe, we're the number one country that has the most illegal immigrants in America? Guess where? Canada. The most illegal immigrants currently, as of 2018, are from Canada. They outnumber the illegals from our southern border by almost 200,000. And they come in through the ports and they come in through the airports. And we've had Homeland Security stopped. How many people do you think Homeland Security stopped for tourism in the United States? Last statistics we have that are complete from 2017. Now, the Trump administration, Sanders came out in the press conference said it was 4,000. Conway came out and said that was an embellishment. The number was a little bit more than 3,000, Joe Doc. And you know how many of those came from our southern border in the first half of last year? Now we got in statistics in 2018. 6 on the terrorist list that came across the southern border. So what we have now is we have the government threatening to have an emergency powers. Emergency powers, folks, just to get an education, there is no emergency powers for the executive, for the president in our Constitution. It is something that presidents have done going all the way back to Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. And I would think the Civil War is an emergency. He suspended, under our Constitution, the writ of habeas corpus. In other words, Joe Doc, if you got locked up by the cops, they have to produce your body under the writ of habeas corpus. You have to be produced for a bail hearing. Now, the next time that we really had this constitutional challenge was when FDR interned in concentration camps Japanese American citizens, not immigrants. They were citizens. And in that decision, Korematsu versus the United States, that was decided to, believe it or not, that emergency power was decided to be constitutional. But you know what? There was a really great dissent, and I'm going to read this, folks, from Justice Frank Murphy. And he says, I dissent, therefore, from this legalization of racism. Racial discrimination in any form and in any degree has no justifiable part whatever in our democratic way of life. All residents of this nation are kin in some way by blood or culture to a foreign land. Yet they are primarily and necessarily a part of the new and distinct civilization called the United States. They must, accordingly, be treated at all times as the heirs of the American experiment and as entitled to all the rights and freedoms guaranteed by the Constitution. So, folks, this has really gotten to the point of politics. I want you to step back and question what's going on. I want you to step back and put this weapon of fear using this fear as a weapon to get something that's not necessary. Reach out, get educated. When you call your legislator, when you call your congresswoman or congressman or your senator, make sure you know, based on this show, what the Constitution says the president can do and can't do.
When we come back after our first commercial break here on Legal Eagles Radio with Sam Pond, we'll meet our guest from Pittsburgh. He'll join us. Back in a moment.
If you want to talk with Sam Pond or any one of his legal experts, call 800-568-7500. That's 800-568-7500.
And back here on Legal Eagles Radio with Sam Pond, along with J-Doc, I'm Joe Kraus, coming to you in Philadelphia on Talk Radio 1210 WPHT, in Pittsburgh on News Talk 1020 KDKA, as we come to you on a Sunday and we move along, Sam, with the conversation here in the beginning of the year that allows us and allows this forum that you have, this big stick, this big microphone, really allows you to educate. You're getting into a topic of conversation today that we've never talked about.
Yeah, and that's in regard to maritime law, admiralty law, is what we're going to talk about today with Brian LaBovick, a good friend of mine who is practices in this area. He's a great trial lawyer. I have spent a number of days and nights with Brian talking to him about our clients and how we represent them with the kind of advocacy that's needed when someone gets injured. So there's a whole, Joe, you talk about Pennsylvania workers' comp, but there's we get into these little pockets of law, and folks need to know every little pocket. Joe, Doc, you're shaking your head, and there's these little nuances that just get the word right. So if you're a longshoreman, you can't collect Pennsylvania workers' comp. If you're a longshoreman down in the port of down here in Philadelphia and Delaware, you can't collect Pennsylvania comp. You're governed by the Longshoremen's Act. If you get injured on the water, there's a whole separate body of law called the Jones Act. These are areas where my firm doesn't practice, but our guest does. So I want to welcome Brian LaBovick to the show. Brian, welcome, and thanks for participating today.
Sam, I can't tell you how pleased I am to be here. Thanks for having me.
And it's always great to have you come up to Pennsylvania. You're originally from the great Steel City. Where are you from?
Yeah, I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I was born in Stanton Heights, and had I not moved to Ohio before my high school years, I would have gone to Peabody High School. But now I believe that's Barack Obama High School. And
you're down now practicing. Your practice is where now?
So we actually have an office down here in Florida, in Palm Beach County, Florida, and an office in Boston. But our main office and main hub and what we do all of the Maritime through is in Florida. We have another office for Maritime with another gentleman up in Boston.
Now, how's the cheesesteaks down there in that neck of the woods?
So I think I mentioned this to you, that I actually hadn't had a cheesesteak since being with you. The cheesesteak that we had was ridiculous. That was not even that was dreamy, crazy food.
Yeah. It's in the
Came
bread,
here,
right?
had one at a place which is supposed to be a Philly transplant, restaurant here in Palm Beach County. And it was awful. I mean, it was just, and maybe I'm spoiled now that I can't have anything but a
well, that probably leads us into the conversation. It's in the water to make the bread. So, and I'm pronouncing water like water.
Water, right?
So,
right.
like in bagel, because everybody knows, New York bagel.
It's in the water. So let's talk about water. Let's talk about getting hurt on the water. And you and I in the preparatory period before the show to this weekend talked about some of the different nuances, the Jones Act and the Maritime and Admiralty law. Just give us a little flavor of why that law is different and what's it govern.
So different. There's a lot of different laws that cover the sea. I mean, there's a lot of different rules. There's laws. There's regulations. I mean, everything that goes on whether it's an in-state waterway, whether it's a navigable waterway, whether it's a pond in your backyard. There's all sorts of different laws and regulations to that. What's very interesting is that the treatment of workers and how workers are treated is very different depending on where in the shipping waterway work on a ship or even work outside the United States is processed. So like you mentioned, longshoremen, which is not one of the things we do, is governed by the Longshore and Harbor Workers' Compensation Act. So that is the Longshore Act, and that's going to cover any of the guys who work on docks, who work on shipping yards, who do piers or terminals, things like that. And they're going to go forward under that act, and that's a relatively limiting act. I think that you and I both know that workers' compensation itself should be self-executing, but isn't. And if you don't get a good lawyer to fight for your rights, you're not going to get the benefits that you otherwise should get. And it's the same thing with longshoremen. And there's guys that do a lot of longshoreman work, and they kind of, if you have longshoreman work in your office, you're doing a lot of claims, and you kind of have to specialize in longshoreman work. There's then something called the Defense-Based Act.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Jones Act.
No. Stay with the Defense-Based Act.
Okay, so Defense-Based Acts I find really interesting because people don't recognize that this would actually cover someone, right? But you have this situation where you have a guy who's the longshoreman, so he's covered, right? And the one that you just mentioned, Jones Act, which is all the guys on the ships. So they would be covered under Jones Act. What happens if you don't work on either, but you fall off while you're walking up the pier? Or what if you are a defense worker and you're working on a base in Saudi Arabia? I mean, what happens if you get injured, which does happen a lot, right? And how does that get covered? So pretty much anyone who is working overseas for a defense contractor, for the defense industry, you're going to be covered by the Defense-Based Act if you're injured overseas. So, for instance, we had a young lady come to us, and she said she was working on a defense base in a foreign country. She was on the tarmac of an airfield, and they were playing Frisbee on their break. And she hurt her knee badly, and she ended up needing a patelectomy. In other words, she needed to remove the patella, and that's a very significant operation for someone.
Yeah.
And what's going to cover that? So we ended up getting the Defense-Based Act to cover that, and she was in good shape because we had to fight for that, but she ended up having a good outcome. And we found good insurance for her on that.
Well, I mean, there's thousands, if not tens of thousands, of Americans that are working for the Defense Department throughout the world, and it's an interesting concept. So, is this more of a schedule-based compensation? In other words, if I was working for a defense contractor and building, shelters for American soldiers in Iraq. And I got hurt or even killed, what does either me or my family get because I got injured or killed working for the Defense Department in Iraq?
So under the Defense-Based Act, they have their own system of compensation, and you would get compensated similar to what you would get in a personal injury case, less pain and suffering.
Oh, so there's no pain and suffering.
So that's it's a more of a workers' compensation.
Yeah,
system.
It sounds like a more. Got it. Yeah,
and it's
Brian,
a federal workers' compensation application.
It's J-Doc, Brian. Somebody gets injured. We talked a little bit before we went on the air. You're on the water. You're on a boat. Let's just say you're a wait staff on a some kind of a party boat or whatever. You get injured there. Now we know in workers' comp, it's different from state to state. How does that work if you're working on a entertainment boat or something like that, and you get injured while you're on that? Does it? What laws govern that in particular? Are they national laws? Are they on the state side? The state side that you're on?
So when we discussed it, I told you it was a really interesting question. And I went and I talked to my associate because I thought it was such an interesting question because I think you've got multiple jurisdictions depending on what you're suing over, right? So if you work on a ship and it's a navigable waterway, you would have a Jones Act claim, and you could bring that state or federal. And you could bring that, depending on where the ship is, in the jurisdiction that you're traveling within. If you are a passenger on the ship, there are passenger acts that cover you as a passenger on a ship, and the Passenger Act would give you the right to go to the jurisdiction where the ship is located in or the federal jurisdiction. But each jurisdiction can dictate out, and they can go forward and know who's the governing legal body for that waterway. So, for example, like I mentioned down here, we have the Intercoastal Waterway, and we have a bridge that connects Palm Beach County to Jupiter Island, which is a really nice, fancy place to live. If you are north of the Cato Bridge, you're covered by Martin County law, and you're going to be arrested by Martin County police, and you're going to bring your claims in Martin County. If you're south of the Cato Bridge, you're going to bring your claims in Palm Beach County, or you're going to be arrested by the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office if you do something wrong, or you'll bring yourself in federal court. Depending on where that boat is located, north or south of the bridge, you're either in the Middle District of Florida or the Southern District of Florida.
It's really interesting, especially when you're in an area like Florida, where obviously there's a lot of entertaining and all those things that go on the water. Here in Pennsylvania, our waterways are typically, not used in that manner. So it's very interesting.
Yeah. So, under Jones Act, because we haven't really gotten there yet, there is a portion of that act that allows you to go state or federal, depending on where you feel the claim is better placed. So as the plaintiff, you would get to make that call. In Florida, we appreciate state court. We have a better state court system with regard to bringing plaintiff's claims than we do a federal court system. That's not true in all jurisdictions.
This is Legal Eagles Radio with Sam Pond as we come to you on Talk Radio 1210 WPHT in Pittsburgh on KDKA. One programming reminder, 1 week from this weekend, next weekend, we'll deal with the topic of immigration. That will be our conversation a week from today. We'll continue with Brian after the commercial break.
Now back to Legal Eagles Radio with Sam Pond. Talk Radio 1210 WPHT.
And back here on Talk Radio 1210 WPHT and in Pittsburgh on KDKA, Brian LaBovick is our special guest today, along with J. M. Joe Kraus, and of course our gracious host, Sam Pond. Sam?
Joe, interesting conversation with Brian about these little nuances. I think we're going to get into something a little bit more broader in regard to conversation, something that a lot of Americans and a lot of our listeners probably have done, and that's going on the cruise. I have some good memories. Really good memories, which I'm not going to get into about my time on a cruise and my single days many, many years ago.
We'd love to hear about them, Sam. Let's switch gears.
They actually had cruise lines back then. But we want to talk a little bit about what the law is in regard to cruise ships and how's that work if I get injured while I'm on a cruise. A lot, Brian, right now we've seen a lot in the news, at least I have from the periphery in regard to people jumping off cruise ships or falling off cruise ships. And then just people getting injured on cruise ships. I guess if you were dancing, like Joe Dock did when he's on the cruise.
I'm doing a moonwalk all the way from deck to deck.
Boy, that's something to see. Thank God we're on radio. Anyway, if you got hurt on the dance floor, and I'm not talking about getting hurt by watching Joe Dock dance, but if you got hurt on the dance floor on a cruise ship, tell us a little bit about cruise ship liability and what happens, because we just have so many. I was happening on the holiday being down in the Caribbean, on the Caribbean island, and the amount of cruise ships that are out there and the amount of people on them is just staggering. So give us a little flavor for the law, if you would, Brian.
So what's interesting about the cruise ship law is that the cruise ship, because it's such a powerful political lobby, has allowed them to exempt themselves from a lot of federal maritime law and the methodologies by which a passenger can bring an action against the cruise ship. And they've done a really good job politicking to keep themselves safe from liability or limiting their liability. So that's very interesting. Your cruise ship liability rests on the back of your ticket, which isn't a real big document, but it carries a contractual agreement between you and that cruise line that says you're going to behave in a lawsuit against them exactly the way they want you to behave to try to enforce your rights. So you have to pay attention
Whoa.
Yeah, I know, ridiculous.
Wow, holy moly, this is a powerful lobbyist. Lobby, that is really incredible. But I don't mean to interrupt you. I'm just sitting here stunned. And I was totally unaware, but I'm listening.
So I'm not sure what your SOLs are in Pennsylvania. I think they're probably a little longer than this. But if you
it's
get
2 and 3 years
for
it's 2 years, and then for personal injury, and then it's 3 years for workers' comp.
So if
we're
you
talking
get
about statute of limitations, folks. We're talking about statute of limitations.
Yeah, statute of limitations. The time period that you have to bring your action, or else you lose it forever, right?
Yep.
On the back of your cruise ticket, you'll notice a provision that talks about giving the cruise ship notice. And it says that before you can bring an action, you need to give them a standard amount of time. Most of those people say you have to give them at least 6 months notice that you were injured on the ship. That could have happened the minute that you were injured. You could have gone to the doctor on the ship and said you were injured and explained to the crew what happened, etc. Or it could happen, when you get back and your lawyer writes them a letter that says you were injured on the ship and you're bringing action. But if you sit on it and then you try to do it late, you're going to have a problem. So some cruise ships have even tried to make it 4 months, but most of them I think are 6 months, and I haven't seen one less than 6 months in a long time. So assuming that it is 6 months, that you have to give them notice, the next thing that you have to realize is that the back of that ticket gives you a 1-year statute of limitations. So look at how the time binds you.
So Brian, you have 6 months to give notice, put them on notice something happened, and then you have a year, which really, when you talk about the policy behind the statute of limitations, is in my experience, having multi-jurisdictional practices, I've never heard of such restrictive requirements because these requirements are there to allow people to gather evidence, have witnesses, have memories, fresh, and 6 months and a year is just egregious.
It's a really short time period for people, and people are not prepared for that. It really spurns on a lot of unnecessary litigation. So if you do any type of negligence work in your firm, or if you have a lot of firms, I know that you guys have a lot of firms that do regular negligence work. A lot of claims, I would say probably in the 90 percentile, maybe 80s plus percentile, are settled pre-litigation. In other words, you write in the claim, you discuss the true damages, you come up with a liability analysis, and you settle that claim before the courts are burdened with it. And that's that grace period that a statute of limitation gives you to try to avoid that litigation. Well, the cruise industry has tried to do the exact opposite. They've tried to force you to make your decision or to have to come to court before the full damages are at fruition, and you must bring that claim within 1 year of the time that you step off that ship or that injury has occurred, not from the time of your notice, Sam. So you don't get like 6 months and then another year. You get 1 year total, right? And if you don't bring it in the right jurisdiction, then you lose your claim also. So most of the cruise lines all insist, which is why our office is here in the Southern District of Florida, that you bring your claim in the federal court in the Southern District of Florida. In fact, I would say all of them except maybe Princess, which I think is an L.A.-based cruise line, and they make you go to L.A., and Holland America, which is a Seattle-based company, and they make you go to Seattle. But other than that, the ones that we've all dealt with have all forced us to be here in Florida. And that's why we get so many law firms, nationally that bring down their cruise cases to us. Brian,
question, the challenges of investigating and enforcing negligence cases or even criminal cases. Since you're dealing with a cruise ship and you're, that obviously is leaving port and sometimes going to different countries, who is the enforcement out there on a cruise ship because we've all seen, 2020 and different situations that might happen. Who investigates it and how difficult is it to enforce?
It can be incredibly difficult to investigate because while you're out, the cruise ship investigates on their own, and then in certain situations, they are obligated to, when they get back to port, to turn that documentation over to the FBI for investigation, and if they don't, then they've got a liability situation. So, for example, on a sexual assault, sexual harassment situation, rape situation, I don't want to say we do a lot of cruise line rape cases or sex assault cases, but we get more of them than you would expect, right? So anytime there's a crime, they should be reporting that crime to the FBI as the federal agency from federal, for these situations. And that's posted online.
Brian, Joe? I'm sorry, Joe. Doc.
Well, I was going to say, what if you're in Fiji? You're in port in Fiji. You're not in American waters. Are there jurisdictional disputes that make it even more complicated?
There can be jurisdiction. Let's say that you're over in Fiji. Let's say you're in China or whatever. But if you're on an American cruise line, a cruise line that is from America, you're going to be bound by the ticket, and that ticket is going to tell you to come here.
Well, what
and we're
happens
going
if
to
I'm in
work
the
on the
Mediterranean?
jurisdiction of Florida.
Brian,
or
what
the
happens if
federal law.
Brian, what happens if I'm on a foreign cruise line? Like, I mean, I don't know, some of these cruise lines that are maybe up in the or in
Shanghai
the Mediterranean
Cruises or Fiji
whatever.
Cruises from Fiji.
Yeah, what's the jurisdictional issues there?
So that it's going to be very difficult. Number one, you're going to be bound to the jurisdictional limits of the laws of their country versus whether their cruise lines have a contractual right to force you to do something different than the laws of their country. But U.S. laws would not apply. You're a foreign, tourist in a foreign land working in foreign laws, and unless the Warsaw Convention or the Hague or something similar would apply that I can't think of in this instance, I don't think federal law is going to save you from bringing your action. A lot of the cruise lines work on Swiss law. Viking is a Swiss company; they work on Swiss law. So, that's a different
the travel agents. Do they educate
That's a good question, Joe.
individuals on making decisions like that? Because when you step off of American soil and you're getting on a cruise ship, you should know what your rights are. Number one, I'm not saying dangers, but what the conditions are when you walk on that ship. Is there a responsibility by the travel agent?
Sadly, I haven't seen a negligence claim brought to a travel agent for failure to disclose risks and dangers of this particular cruise line because they have, connectivity to a country that doesn't allow you to bring your claim for damages later on. That's an interesting kind of creative thought. I haven't done it, and I don't know anyone who has done it. I do know this. I've gone on cruises. I've gone on cruises that are foreign cruises as well as local cruises, and I have never been warned. So,
interesting.
Brian, we're coming up to the break, and I really want to start talking about this rights that someone has, basically being on the back of a ticket. And I really want to talk about that in regard to arbitrations, Seventh Amendment issues, etc.
Brian LaBovick is our special guest here on Legal Eagles Radio with Sam Pond as we come to you in Philadelphia on Talk Radio 1210 WPHT, in Pittsburgh on KDKA. Remember, if you want to get in touch with Sam, you can call him on the Legal Eagles Radio hotline. The number is 1-800-723-8715. That's 1-800-723-8715. 8715. It's our Legal Eagles Radio hotline. That hotline is active 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We'll get to a commercial break. We'll return. We'll continue the dialogue on Legal Eagles Radio with Sam Pond. Our special guest today, Brian LaBovick. Back in a moment.
Talk Radio 1210 WPHT Legal Eagles Radio with Sam Pond.
And back here on Legal Eagles Radio with Sam Pond. Sam, as I consume the information of our conversation today, I can't help but wonder how many people from around the Delaware Valley and how many people in western Pennsylvania travel and do so by cruise, take a cruise. There are so many people that were unaware of some of the information being provided today. Good stuff.
I think, I no doubt about it. I mean, we all know people that have gone on cruises. We've gone on cruises ourselves. Who do you know that hasn't really been on a cruise when you really think about it? I mean, it's probably half of America. It's hundreds of thousands of listeners, I'm assuming, in our listening area. And they would have no idea.
Well, and this show actually reminds me of last week's show. We talked about realtors, and when you go to closing, having an attorney there to tell you what the fine print is so you don't walk away. I mean, this is a great example. I mean, that people need to know what their rights are, what their rights aren't, what the conditions are before they go and put themselves in somebody else's hands. It's incredible.
Well, I'll pose this question, Joe, to Brian, because I don't really know if there's a hell of a lot they can do. I mean, they're kind of bound. They buy the ticket, and it says, hey, this is the deal. You can't go and have an attorney review the back of the ticket and negotiate a new set of terms.
No, but you could learn your risks when you walk on that boat.
Now, that's knowledge. You're absolutely on point. Absolutely on point. And at least now that you go on there, and to a certain degree, I guess you assume the risk, but you might be a little bit more careful in understanding that if you get hurt, you're going to have a problem. So, Brian, look. What do we got going on here in regard to this back of the ticket? Is this legal? Does it stand up in court? Do I have a trial by jury under the Seventh Amendment? Do I have to go to arbitration? what can I have an attorney review the ticket? What are all these answers to all these questions?
All right, let me see if I can sort through at least some of it that I know. Number one, under federal maritime law, there's no jury trials at all. So once you're a part of federal maritime law, if you're talking about that, you're not typically talking in any real circumstances about getting a jury trial.
Well, let me stop you there. Let me stop you. Admiralty law, there's no trial by jury, right?
In Admiralty law, there's no trial by jury.
Now, folks, I want you to do a little history and a little understanding of the law, because that arises back in the old days of us being seafarers in the country that we broke off from, Great Britain, because basically back then the colonialists that came out and they said, hey, we don't like this stamp tax, and we should have a right, before we go to jail, we should have a right to have a jury trial. And basically they put it under the Admiralty law so they couldn't get a right to jury trial. Very, very important point. So anything with the Wooders, you don't have a right to a jury trial. The Seventh Amendment doesn't stand muster. Now,
let me tell you what you can do sometimes. So there's, that traditionally that's a very easy set pat answer, right? But as a maritime practitioner, you look for loopholes. You look for capacity to make things a little better. Bringing multiple claims, sometimes some state claims with federal claims, in state court, you can create situations and opportunities that would get you to a jury trial.
Oh,
it's very case specific. So, for example, I'll give you some examples. Let's say in maritime law, in Jones Act. If you're in a Jones Act case, and your ship crashes or the ship had something go wrong with it, you're going to be able to bring your General Jones Act maintenance and cure. So that's your wages and your medical care. That's maintenance and cure. And then you're also able to bring your general negligence counts. That's your pain and suffering under Jones Act. And then you're also allowed to bring your unseaworthiness counts. And then you're also allowed to bring your general negligence counts. And you can bring those in state court, and you can pick your jurisdiction if you're within that jurisdiction when you're injured. So by looking at factual circumstances, trying to pick different things out, getting to a general negligence count and adding it in some cases you can create a situation where you can go and grab that right to a jury trial from one of those things and bring it in for the whole case.
Brian, we talked before we went on the air, and I think you talked about the cruise lobby, the cruise ship lobby, and because the first thing I think of is, well, why are things like this? Isn't this ancient? Well, obviously, we're always talking about the gun lobby. Well, obviously, evidently, the cruise ship lobby is extremely powerful as well.
Yeah. So arbitration is their biggest point, just so you know, the cruise ship lobby. And the cruise ships really won the day on a lot of these issues. If you go back to 91, there was a Carnival Cruise Lines case called Carnival Cruise Lines v. Shute, S-H-U-T-E, and that was a big case that allowed them to utilize the back of the ticket to start limiting the rights of passengers and to try to create that. And the courts, that's a Supreme Court case, and the courts bought that argument, and they created this maritime, kind of cutout and allowed them to get around it.
Brian, we talked, just shifting gears a little bit, we talked about when we had prepped for this show about the Pennsylvania rule in regards to maritime law. What is that? Pennsylvania rule.
Personally, for me, the Pennsylvania rule is the most plaintiff-friendly, common-sense thought process that anyone could have within maritime law. So I love the Pennsylvania rule, and I love the fact that I'm from Pennsylvania, and that's what it is. Basically, it's a shifting the burden to prove causation, right? So if you can show that any regulation was breached in the course of the ship moving and the accident occurring, whatever that is, whether it's a collision between two moving objects, an allision, which is the ship moving, and then a stationary object like a piling, that the burden will shift on the ship owner so that if there was you can show that the regulations were breached, any of the regulations were breached, that the ship owner has to prove they were not behaving negligent instead of that they were behaving. We don't have to prove they were behaving negligent. They have to prove they were not.
Where does this apply? Where does it happen?
It happens mostly on boat accidents.
When
so,
you say
for
boat
example,
accidents, we're not talking about cruise ships, right? We're talking about
no, we're typically not talking about cruise ships because cruise ships typically don't hit things.
Okay.
So, but if the cruise ship does something to ground itself, there was a big cruise ship that grounded itself a little while ago, and a lot of people were injured. That hit a stationary object. That's going to be a situation where all the victims of that ship are going to be able to say that, look, you have to prove you didn't do something negligent. If you ran aground, you clearly did something negligent. Prove to me you weren't acting negligent. So, for example, if they could prove that somehow the Russians had built a shelf that had never been determined to be there before out of metal, like a giant metal building underground in the middle of the Greek waterways, then maybe they could get around that negligence claim. But just running aground like they did, probably impossible.
Well, Brian, listen, it's been an interesting conversation, and we want to thank you for taking the time to educate us on maritime law, about being on a cruise ship and hopefully not getting interest. But we really, really appreciate you being here. Folks,
send that man some cheesesteaks, will you, Sam?
Yeah, you got to stop back up. We got to take care of you. We got to make you happy again. It's all about the water.
Absolutely.
So anyway,
I'm coming up for it. It's worth it.
Yeah,
Thank you so much for having me.
We always appreciate your company. So come up and we'll talk about representing our clients and fighting the good fight.
And Brian LaBovick,
do you have time for me to just say one more thing?
Sure.
I want to just say one more thing for 2 seconds.
Yep.
When you started this program, you started it talking about the situation of the government shutdown, and then you made a really important point about a marriage and how marriages work, right? And all I can say is that I have had a really strong marriage, and I have a really strong firm like you do. And the spirit of cooperation and the ability to cooperate and negotiate and compromise comes to really good, reasonable solutions. And our government has been very unable to do that. And unfortunately, this particular administration has stuck a fork in the ground and said, I'm not moving past this line. And no matter what you compromise on, if you don't come 100% to me, it's never going to happen. And I don't think that's a very significantly
well, Brian, you actually took that's great. You ended the show exactly how I was going to say it, because this shutdown right now, the second under this administration, has exceeded all of the pre-existing shutdowns in our government in our entire history. That's how unreasonable it's gotten. That's how crazy it's gotten. That's how ego-driven it's gotten. It's got to stop. Raise your voice and be heard.
See you next week, everybody.
This program is a paid commercial announcement and in no way represents the views of WPHT or its management.